person. I was particularly excited to go back because, as Frederick well mentioned, I had the opportunity to be a guest researcher back in 2022. And it is precisely during those times that I was working with some of the archival material that I wanted to share with you today. So that's why I thought it was a nice way to come back full circle and then show you a little bit about what I was doing when I was within you in Brussels some years ago. And what I thought I would do is to then focus on the Geneva chapter of my PhD, and in particular foreground let's say the protagonism, as Frederick well mentioned, of Victor Horta, a towering Belgian architect, precisely because I thought that would be interesting for this community. But as Frederick will very kindly mentioned, this is part of was part of my PhD project, and now hopefully first book project, monograph project. I still don't have any news on that yet, but I'll keep you posted. And this project I titled Architects of the Better World. And I did it because he took it from a sentence that the US President Truman delivered at the 1945 San Francisco conference, in which he urged the delegates attending to see themselves as architects of the better world in their efforts to create the United Nations. And I thought it was a good example, as Frederick well said, of the ways in which we in our field, international lawyers, but also our neighboring fields, use these metaphors from our architecture and geography to think of the international. And what I did in the kind of broad arc project, and this is the table of contents, is that what I tries to explore then how throughout the 20th century a very specific kind of place was created to host international laws turned to institutions, as David Kennedy famously called it. And that is what I call the international parliament complex, partially, as I'll show you a little bit later, drawing from Horta himself and the kind of language that he and his contemporaries used. But basically, what I do throughout the project is that I study then how different international organizations, most prominently those of universal reach, such as the League of Nations and the League of Nations, then try to create a building for themselves, starting in interwar Geneva, going all the way to the end of the Cold War and this kind of great moment of the 90s. And in particular today, what I wanted to do was to foreground the Geneva chapter. In particular, because as I mentioned, that was one in which Victor Horta had a special salience and importance in his capacity as jury of the president of the jury of architects at the League of Nations. And I thought for that reason it would be interesting. But I also wanted to mention that a chapter 3, which was on the former buildings of the International Labour Organization, now the World Trade Organization. I very much had the pleasure of presenting it back in 2022 at your institution. Very happy to share that since it's been published in an architecture journal, and we can talk about the challenges of that if anyone is interested. But I did want to foreground that the feedback that I got back in that occasion in 2022 was very helpful, not only for that chapter as a whole, but for the project moving forward. And as some of you know very well, this is part of a kind of broader research agenda I've been trying to pursue, in which what I've been trying to think is how can we think of a more material history of international law, institutions, and ideas? Because my sense, and of course we've all been being part of this conversation for several years, is that a lot of the good work that has been done within this discipline has been, let's say, concentrated first and foremost around the histories of ideas and concepts. We have excellent work on the life and work of lawyer diplomats, European and non-European, male and female, and I think this is a very promising agenda that I was kind of brought into intellectually and that I still partake. Most of us, or some of us, will meet just in a couple of weeks at The Hague to talk about Groucho. So again, I'm very committed to this agenda, but at the same time, what I thought or I've been trying to do is to think, what could a different approach to the history of international law look like? What if we foreground instead material objects, infrastructures, commodities, in the case of the dissertation as a whole, buildings, for instance, and how can that change a little bit the kind of aspect of the story? And in the broader project, as he mentioned, I'm interested in what I call the birth of the international parliamentary complex. And I use this formula, the birth of, to kind of put it in conversation with a broader tradition of Foucauldian work around, for instance, the birth of the clinic, the birth of the prison, that I think allows us to think carefully about the connection between material, very concrete spaces like the room I'm sitting in right now, and wider kind of ideological, discursive, in our case, juridical projects, and to see the relationship between those two different elements. And as I said, I was particularly interested in thinking about spaces such as the headquarters of the UN or the League of Nations as international parliaments, partly because this is the language that I saw over and over again in my sources. So this is the first appearance of Victor Horta today. You see, for instance, it's a letter that he signs again in his capacity as chairman of the jury of architects in French, although the league also retain an English translation, of course, in which you see that he concludes the sentence saying that basically the kind of challenge ahead for the organization was to create a building that had the dignity of a true parliament of nations. And I was drawn to this because throughout the century, in the different languages I was working with, this is the kind of things I saw continuous reference to. The idea that, for instance, the building in Vienna, where I'm currently based right now, also had to work as some sort of world parliament, as a world parliament, that the building that had to be constructed in New York City had also to embody some sort of not only capital of the UN, but in a way capital of the world, more broadly understood. So what I saw is that the language, the techniques, the kind of mold, the template of the domestic parliament as a technology of, let's say, liberal governance was being used very aggressively to think of what it meant to have a more democratic form of international relations. And particularly how I understand this mandate is that basically this is the kind of material manifestation of what we historians have typically called the new diplomacy or the turn towards a new diplomacy after the Great War of 1914. At the end, if one of the promises that President Woodrow Wilson, who himself would later give the name to one of the buildings in the Geneva complex, but we won't talk about that here now, is that after the war, what we needed was open covenants of peace that were publicly negotiated, this very strong criticism of the secret treaty, especially the secret treaty of alliance, which, as Frederick kindly hinted, that's a little bit what I want to do more in my kind of new agenda moving forward. But the premise is that if this promise is true, you need spaces for this sort of conversation to unfold. This is not only an ideological project, it is very much an architectural one. It is one that requires a purpose-built architecture in which these new conversations can take place. And that's why the new buildings that we see created for these organizations have to be then kind of very complex machines, so to say, that allow for this very high and noble rhetoric, while at the same time serving as very concrete spaces for negotiation and deliberation. I thought a good example of that comes from Albert Cohen's very famous novel, Belle du Seigneur, so itself written in the context of the League of Nations and the ILO, in which Albert Cohen worked himself. There's this idea that what the Palais had to do was to be this space that allowed for ambition and calculation, in which people could come and negotiate and participate. And of course, in a way, for those who are familiar with the novel, the building itself, or the buildings of the Geneva complex in a different way, they tend to also be protagonists of the story in a one way, taking particular roles, serving as comparisons to other buildings in Geneva and Brussels, etc. So the point of departure, what I wanted to do in this chapter, is to understand the history of this building, a place that is perhaps all too familiar to some of you. Perhaps some of you have participated in lawmaking initiatives within it, or the brighter kind of UN complex that sits around it. Of course, there are many people here in the virtual room who are quite familiar with so-called international Geneva. But what I wanted to do in the project was to understand how such thing as international Geneva came to be in the first place. Of course, for our eyes nowadays, it is quite obvious to think that it has always been an international city. But as we know, there's no kind of correlation between those factors. And what I wanted to tell is the story of how this actually came to be in the first place, and how a city that, yes, had a very strong kind of Calvinist tradition, and that kind of linked it with certain conversations about internationalism. Geneva was called at this period, and has been called before, some sort of Protestant Rome, from sort of other, sort of lack of a different name. So that, of course, gives it some sort of function, an internationalist function, but its choice to be the capital of the world, to use the formula that some people use later for the UN, is nothing but obvious. By the early 1920s, Geneva really didn't have the infrastructure, think, for instance, of the train station or the airport that would be later built, that really warranted its kind of inclusion in an international kind of network or circuit of conferencing and debating. And this was very clear to some of the protagonists involved, and I'll talk more about that. And I'm interested, of course, not only in how the exterior of the building took shape, but also how, in relation to some of its interior decoration, you see very concrete manifestations of political projects clashing and expressing their kind of worldview of what they think international law, the League, or what we now call the so-called liberal rules-based order, should serve and should look like. But before that, I thought it would be kind of useful. I mean, also because, as Frederick well noted, it's a kind of very out of the box project in relation to its interdisciplinary commitments to try to think a little bit about how to think about art, aesthetics, material culture in legal history. And I think this is a question that is common to many people in this virtual room that have long been concerned about, for instance, iconography or the portrayal of royal imperial power and the ways in which that might kind of enrich the ways we think about legal history. And for that reason, what I thought it would be useful was to begin trying to think in different ways in which I see that in the literature, especially the current literature and international law, this sort of approach is being done. Not necessarily to highlight that one is better than the other, although I have a clear kind of horse in the race, as you will see, but just to have like a kind of broader methodological conversation to begin before we talk about the palais itself. So on the one hand, I see in the literature, and some of you might be familiar with these colleagues, a kind of very strong tendency towards what I would call the deployment of a phenomenological approach to law and architecture. So, I mean, some of you might be familiar with the work around, for instance, the stained glass windows of the Court of Justice in The Hague, for instance, International Court of Justice in The Hague, as I think being a good example of this tendency. And I think I call it phenomenological, and I associate chief and foremost with our friends or colleagues at the Legal Sightseeing Project out of VU Amsterdam, with the idea that what they want to do is to put themselves in the kind of shoes of someone who is experiencing the art and the architecture, and to, from that position, draw conclusions about what it says about international law. So I think, yeah, here I include a picture of it, but for instance, I think a very good example of that is Renske's Bos kind of chapter along a walk along the Rue de la Loi in Brussels. And I wanted to include it because, of course, there's a Brussels related conversation in which what she really does is to kind of walk to Brussels, to this very kind of central avenue that leads up to what we call the European Quarter, and reflect how does this make her see or think about the EU and the way it represents its power in the world, for instance. I also included a picture of a piece that is now under review, that is part of a special issue that me and Stefano are editing right now, that is all about also about thinking what does it mean to visit the the Peace Palace at the International Courts of Justice as a tourist, and buy souvenirs and buy ice cream, and so that's the kind of work that they're trying to pursue. And I think it's very interesting, but for us as legal historians, I think there's a challenge there, in the sense that I think it's very difficult to square this phenomenological tradition with our concern for primary sources, and to go again to the debate now, but concerns about anachronism and the interpretation of the past. Because, of course, I can write about how I experience nowadays in 2024 as a Colombian, as Frederick well said, the EU or the International Court of Justice, and I think that's going to be interesting for a series of purposes. But I think as legal historians, we might rightly wonder, what does that tell us, if at all, about how the architect of those buildings in the late 19th century, early 20th century, or mid 20th century thought about those buildings or their spaces or the work they were doing? There's a certain gap there. And my fear is that it's very easy to interpret these buildings in relation to our own contemporary kind of concerns and preoccupations. And I think a good example of that is offered by what I would call a reflective approach. And here I put kind of three interventions that I see kind of very important or very kind of significant of that. And they're all three very good books. I think, I mean, many of you might be familiar with Marco Duranti's Human Rights, Conservative Revolution. I think it's a wonderful monograph for different reasons. The End Time of Human Rights by Stephen Goff Hopgood also has a little bit on the UN complex in Manhattan about it. Daniel Daimler's book on Bauhaus laws, which is all about the relationship between, let's say, the modernist architecture school and modernist law is a good example. And finally, I included a little picture of John Bernard Muller, who has also been, I think, in the public eye, kind of very spokesperson for the research on the intersections between democracy and architecture, no? And I call this reflective because I think, in a way, what they're all doing is trying to see how the building reflects certain ideals, democratic, authoritarian, liberal, lawyer-like, etc. The quest is trying to understanding how the external appearance of the building or its style, etc., one gets hints to kind of a wider or a more kind of substantive normative project. So, for instance, I've always wondered a little bit why Marco Duranti starts his book on the Peace Palace. Some of you might remember also the chapter, because if you really want to talk about European human rights as a project, it's a little bit of a weird place to start with. But what he says is the Peace Palace can represent some of the liberal commitments, the Christian commitments of what later would be the human rights movement and the European Court of Justice. So that's a little bit what this spirit is trying to do. And I think a good example of the limitations and the power of this reflective approach really comes when Stephen Hopgood tries to make an argument about how the UN's complex is about transparency in the same way that the modern law or the modern human rights project is concerned about transparency. This is a line that is familiar to many of us, no? I mean, the kind of public discussion about architecture, the idea is that modern architecture with its kind of stained glass with wide windows, iron and steel kind of architecture is really about transparency, but allowing the citizen to see what's happening inside. Now, there's this very famous kind of conversation in the 90s about how to rebuild the German Reichstag. So a little bit in this direction, you know what I'm talking about. But my concern is that as I went back to some of the architects involved in these projects, I didn't really see them talking about transparency at all. For instance, Le Corbusier, the very famous Swiss turned French architect, who is also a little bit a protagonist in my story in this chapter, he's not really someone who was particularly concerned about transparency as a political sort of ideal, let's say. I mean, very famously, he worked for a lot of different patriots throughout his career. So I think that this reflects, or let's say, this tendency of modern literature reading these 20th century buildings through the idioms of transparency is a good example of one of the kind of flaws and limitations of this more reflective approach when it comes to primary sources or to imposing on the past our own kind of interpretations of what modern architecture is about. And that's why what I've tried to do in the project, and you will have to see, you will be the judge if you think this is successful or not, is to take what I've called the more structural approach, in which what I've been trying to do is rather to understand how did the people involved in these complexes, architects, statespeople, lawyers, artists, reacted to the context of their times. I tried to make sense of the challenges, try to make sense of the kind of aesthetical and political choices behind their models, and try to defend them, all with being all while at the same time being part of very thick institutional structures of decision making. So, for instance, an example I put here, I mean, I won't talk about it too much today because, again, today I want to focus on the League of Nations and not so much on the UN complex. But you'll see that what I'll do today in general tends to be quite similar for the figure of Victor Horta, is to try to understand, for instance, how in the context of what would happen in New York a couple of years later, decisions were made. And this, you know, kind of a hierarchy structure that you see there is a good example of what I think legal historians can try to study to make sense of those decisions. So this, you see, it basically tells you how was the kind of organization of decision making within the institution in relationship to the building, both in relation to external kind of stakeholders, such as, for instance, the federal U.S. government, the local U.S. government, but also through different ways, kind of non-state actors, which are a little bit less seen here, like the Rockefeller family, which is one of the figures here in the black and white, John Rockefeller Jr. So that's a little bit what I'm kind of seeking to understand in the case of Victor Horta, as we will see in a second. But in sum, what I like of this approach is what I've tried to call, following Eyal Weizman, a famous Israeli architectural historian, the idea that what we can understand is politics in matter. So not the reflection of politics in matter, which is, I think, what would be more this reflective approach, not how matter impacts us. So that's the more phenomenological route, but rather how the political decisions get entrenched into actually build concrete spaces. And that is basically now, in the remaining minutes that I have left, what I try to understand in the Geneva complex. So the starting point for this kind of structure of decision making is the idea that at the end of the day, as I kind of highlighted, Geneva did not have the proper infrastructure to really become a worldly city of international diplomacy. And to make that happen, we had a very complex kind of negotiation of different actors, both, let's say, from public authority, but also private actors, both from, let's say, traditional national foreign service, but also subnational actors. So something I try to do a lot of effort is showing how, for instance, the Canton and Republic of Geneva as a kind of sub-Swiss entity really was very important in this process, but also architectural associations, private businessmen acting especially as philanthropists, for instance. So all of these were involved in making international Geneva, as you know, as we know it. And I think that for our conversation of legal historians, what I really want to highlight is that all of this decision-making process were highly juridified. That means that you needed to have an answer to all the sorts of legal questions that were going to be raised throughout the process. So, for instance, could the league, for instance, be subject to a mortgage on its territory? What is the relationship between Swiss law, international law, that regulates this sort of problems? Nowadays, we know that international organizations have a quite fixed regime of immunities from jurisdiction. But what I'm interested in, especially in the context of this period, is that a lot of these things were up for grabs. They were still being codified, they were still being determined. And it is that kind of interplay between actors which sets the rules for what is now international institutional law as we know it. In particular, I want to really highlight the role of the architectural competition in this context. I'll speak more about it later, but I mean, just as a general note, something that I kind of learned throughout this project is that architectural competitions never work out the way people want them to. Both, for instance, in Geneva and in Vienna was the source of much controversy. The architects immediately call their lawyers and litigate against the organizations. So, for instance, as legal historian, that's a very rich kind of source of information or kind of tradition that we can work with that is might be less of the attention of architectural historians, but that can tell you a lot about, for instance, the jurisdictional competences within the league and how legal individuals interacted with the league as a whole. So that is the kind of context in which I wanted to start. And as I mentioned, basically what became clear is that the building of this complex in Geneva was a scandal from the very beginning. So this is just an example of one of the different kind of little notes that I found in Victor Horta's scrapbook of, newspaper sources at the time, which shows that he was very concerned by the way that the Belgian public opinion, and more broadly understood the French-speaking public opinion, also collecting newspaper articles from France, were going to reflect on his involvement in this story. And this is quite significant because, as he mentioned, the kind of starting point of this whole endeavor is that there really wasn't the space in Geneva as the Protestant Rome to hold the League of Nations. If you see some of the early kind of memoirs or documents of, for instance, the first League of Nations General Assembly in 1920, you see a whole lot of criticism about the lack of proper infrastructure space in Geneva. In particular, this kind of very famous image that maybe some of you have seen before, the first assembly, the cover, for instance, of Aloni's book on environmental protection and the League of Nations, was held in a place called the Calvinium, La Salle de la Réformation, and there was all sorts of criticism about its aptitude for international meetings, not alone because of its kind of very strong Calvinist resonance, of course, but also more broadly because it was a barn-line structure that didn't really work. It was precarious. It was cold. It was hot. You see that there was all sorts of concerns about this. And what became interesting to me is that at this stage, really, the Belgian authorities realized that if they played their hands correctly, they had a good potential at maybe bringing the whole league project back home to Brussels. In particular, Jean Monnet, a young Undersecretary General of the organization, is going to be very skeptical about the idea of the league being in Geneva and will push very strongly for the move to Brussels. Although he was not successful, we know now that in hindsight, this was quite important for then his later experience with the European communities and what would later become the European Union. But in this moment in the early 1920s, the Geneva authorities and the Swiss authorities realized that they need to do something to retain the League of Nations. And what I try to show then in this chapter is that there's all sorts of donations and gifts given, especially of land, to kind of entice the League to stay in Geneva proper. So in another chapter, in the one I presented some years ago, I focus on this building over here, the kind of plot of land, and later where the International Labour Organization building was created. For the purpose of this chapter, I will try to focus on the kind of temporary building that the League of Nations operated. That is now the Palais Wilson, where the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights operates here in Geneva. But above all, the kind of very early on sense that what they needed to do was to build their own conference space, their own assembly space. And initially, the project is that it would be here in the kind of area surrounding the lake between these two buildings. You see there are different kind of options of the plots of land that would be donated. Those who are familiar with the UN in Geneva know that that was not the case. But initially, for the purpose of, for instance, the competition and the original sort of like tenders, this was the plan, that it will be a lakeside property next to the other kind of international buildings in the area. And while Belgium was unsuccessful in trying to bring the league back to Brussels, they were given, I think, as a measure of like temporary satisfaction, the idea that they should preside the first council of the league, which is, of course, its most important organ, and it worked in very similar ways to how, for instance, the United Nations Security Council work nowadays, although we could talk a little bit about the differences, but I think it's useful to think about those continuities. And for that reason, it is Paul Iman, the very famous Belgian diplomat, that who would have the kind of first role in all the questions related to the building, including in the composition of its jury of architects. So the league realizes that they need a big competition to create this new building. For the ILO building that I mentioned, they had only allowed the participation of Swiss architects. That was seen as very problematic in hindsight. So now they knew that they wanted something bigger, and they wanted to have this competition with a jury that would evaluate substantially the best project at hand for the league. And basically, what I try to show throughout the chapters is that in close conversations between Iman and Eric Drummond, first Secretary General of the League, big parts of this was decided even before it was formally proposed to the Council. But I mean, this is standard practice. This is not to say that it's kind of illegal or anything. It's just this is how a lot of these decisions were taken in close negotiations between these leading diplomats from the capitals, even before they kind of reached the floor of Geneva and the public debate. So in particular, Drummond and Himan discussed, and they said that they want to compose a committee with nationals of countries not too distant from Geneva. And in practice, this meant France, Great Britain, Italy, Switzerland, and Belgium. Himan felt very kind of, he knew that it was quite suspicious to ask a Belgian to nominate or to suggest the idea there should be a Belgian architect. And he tried to say that he was not really partial to it. He rather wanted to respond to the important reputation that his country had acquired in regards to architecture. In their correspondence, they also kind of realized that it was likely that there would be accusations that the jury was lopsided. If it was only too focused on Western states and especially formerly Entente states. And of course, for that reason, they suggest adding Austria into the mix, a polity which itself had a kind of complicated history with the League. There was a whole discussion. I really don't want to go into too much detail, but at some point they suggest adding delegates, substitutes, not substitutes, adding, for instance, eventually the Netherlands and Spain. All of this was quite complicated. At the end, they also added a Swedish architect, partially because they thought that Sweden could kind of also represent in a way by proxy the kind of aesthetical interest of the United States, which of course was not a member of the League of Nations and as such couldn't have, let's say, its own architect on the jury. So throughout the process, especially in the context of the legal section, there were all sorts of debates about who had the legal and constitutional competence in relation to this committee. Is it being of the jury of architects? Is it being composed by the Secretary General? Is it being composed by the Council? What are the relationships between members, substitutes, etc., etc.? At the end, and this is just a good example, for instance, the kind of very important influence that foreign ministries and just had in the whole process, with the whole idea of adding a Swedish architect, as he mentioned, as some sort of voice for the US, really came from a suggestion of a British civil servant, Herbert Llewellyn Smith, who himself wanted to kind of put this position forward. And he himself actually gives us a kind of very good example of the kind of political values that people attach to this building as a whole. At some point in the Fifth Assembly of the League of Nations, this British delegate says that he's proud to announce that Great Britain is going to donate the acoustics for the new room because they really knew how to create a room for parliamentary discussion. Something that the Swiss delegate, that at the moment the Swiss delegate and president of the assembly, Giuseppe Motta, accepts very proudly, saying that, of course, they had to yield to Great Britain, seeing that she was the mother of parliamentary government in world history. So you see, with very little technical details, you see all sorts of kind of very important ideas of democracy representation and above all who gets to participate and who doesn't. It was really an issue that garnered the attention of very important people around the world. So, for instance, this is just two just very interesting examples I found, not the most kind of significant, but still quite kind of, if anything, colorful. On the right hand, you see a telegraph from Mussolini kind of intervening in relation to the kind of jury of architects, etc., etc. And then on the left, you see a letter from Manley Hudson, the very famous American law professor, after which the Manley Hudson chair at Harvard is named after all, sending a letter to Eric Drummond, my friend, trying to really instigate that the league should adopt a carillon tower, one of those swinging bells kind of operation. So, this was really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds and concerns during that time. And then from a legal history perspective, what interested me is the all sorts of rules that the committee had to debate before it could even start its operations. So, for instance, they decided that French would be the lingua franca of the competition. If you wanted to be an architect in the 1920s and 30s, you had to be able to submit your project in French. There was that, and it was one of the small exceptions to the St. League's wide policy of bilingualism, and there's all sorts of colorful correspondence of members of the jury kind of being very proud of the fact that it's going to be in French. And for instance, there is no German version of the competition, even when the Swiss asked for it, for instance. There are important rules in relation to the costs of each plan, how to submit them. They realize that because this is going to be such a contested affair, they need to send the kind of programming of the competition in a staggered way, so that, for instance, they don't reach Paris basically a month before they reach New Zealand. So they send first the ones for the farthest away countries. So again, this really shows that they're very, very concerned about the legality of what they're doing, and especially the possibility that they could be called into account of doing something unfair that would go in detriment to the ideals of the league. There's a whole conversation we don't really have to go into unless you're interested, relating the participation or the eligibility of non-state members of the league, architects from non-state members. So the US, of course, was not a member, so that caused a lot of set of concerns for American architects who were very committed to the league, wanted to partake in it, but just didn't have a leeway into the whole thing. But I think more broadly, there was a very, very tricky political question regarding the participation of German-speaking architects. So until the Locarno Accords, Weimar Germany was not a member of the league, and as such was not eligible. Its architects were not eligible to participate in the league. This was the official position for quite some time. But very quickly, Drummond and people within the league, realized that this was a very difficult political solution, seeing that, for instance, big parts of the Saarlands and the Rhinelands had been occupied or by France or by league members, and that raised the question of their ability to participate. It's particularly the situation of the free city of Danzig, Gdansk nowadays, was a very, very thorny issue for which the League eventually made a little exception to the participation of German-speaking architects from Danzig. And eventually, they even slightly before the entry of Germany into the League, made that into a wider kind of general eligibility window for German architects. At the end, that didn't really have a lot of impact, although there were some German proposals that were shortlisted. But it does show us that they realized that for instance, the negotiating the eligibility of architects was part of the kind of broader political atmosphere of normalization of relations with Germany as a polity more broadly. And what I'm particularly interested, as I mentioned, is the role of Victor Horta in all of this. And some of you might recognize here the very famous Horta House in Brussels in relation to that. Because the composition of the panel really placed him at the center of the kind of controversy and allowed him at the end to have the last word, even if he maybe declined to exercise it in this whole operation. Because basically, because Heman had been the first president of the League of Nations Council, it was widely seen as obvious that the Belgian architect would preside over the jury of architects. That was the kind of logic behind that, and that was effectively his kind of role in the League, and he was the one who represented the jury officially in many of those conversations. And Horta, let's say, as a figure is quite interesting because he then became a sort of pivot between the two main factions that would emerge in the jury itself. So, I mean, this is a partial story. This is how Le Corbusier or, for instance, Siegfried Gideon have told this story. So, I mean, they have a horse in this race. But the way that architectural historians tend to think of this architectural competition is that it really eventually pitched two sections of the committee against each other, and they had roughly equal number of composition and votes. So on the one hand, you have the people that Le Corbusier would later call the academic faction, the académiciens in French. And those are the people who came mostly from the big empires of the time. So Jacques Lemasquier from France, John James Brunet from the British Empire, and Attilo Muggia from Italy. And they represented the idea that what the League of Nations building should do is to kind of retrieve the ancient glory of European history and bring that into life in Geneva. Of course, there was some degree of controversy between them. Some of them preferred more neoclassical sort of facades. Some of them preferred more Gothic, for instance, experimentations. If you think about the 19th century parliaments, of course, Westminster and the Hungarian parliament on the Danube are really very good examples of this kind of Neo-Gothic revival as a kind of style for this. And against them, what you would see is the kind of emerging, what people would later call the modern movement in international architecture. And again, because it's a Brussels conversation, I wanted to put you a picture of the Palais Stoclet in Brussels as a kind of good example of that. Because what you see in this modernist faction is the architects from the smaller jurisdictions. So Karl Moser, who had a very important career in Zurich, for instance, on behalf of Switzerland, H.P. Berlage from the Netherlands, and especially Joseph Hoffmann from Austria as important kind of pivots in that sense. And the kind of balance of forces here really places Horta in a very awkward position between the two traditions, because Horta had, on the one hand, been a pioneer of the Art Nouveau and the Art Décoratif in Brussels and in Belgium. He was really associated in a way with new forms of architecture, which in a way spoke very clearly to what some people in the modernist movement were trying to do. Most famously, his Maison du Peuple of 1899, even if it now is demolished, really kind of, showed some of his, at least, ideological affinities with some sort of social democratic reformist program moving forward. And that in a way puts him at odds with the kind of traditional conservatives of the, let's say, academic tradition who really wanted a kind of old historicist motif for the League of Nations. But at the same time, Horta just was becoming very, very prominent in Belgian politics at the time. A couple of years later, in 1930, he would be even elevated to a barony, as some of you might know. And then in his involvement with, for instance, with big projects in Brussels, later the train station, for example, really showed that he was in a way a little bit more politically and diplomatically entangled with the people of the kind of academic faction. And I thought that was a good example of the ways in which people are complex and have different loyalties in the ground. It's not that you could say, well, Horta is a modernist, and as such, his modernist idea of the building represents certain values, which is, I think, for instance, what people in the reflective tradition are trying to do. Rather, you see that he's pulled by different things. He likes industrial arts and industrial architecture. He's drawn by this type of architecture, but he's also very aware that he is kind of embedded in a very complex institutional diplomatical landscape, and in particular, his ties to the building establishment and the foreign service, I think, really limit the possibilities that he has in this context. So eventually, after a lot of negotiation, the League jury of architects decided that out of the 378, almost 400 projects that they received, none of them had a clear legal basis to be chosen. Hort himself sends a letter to Eric Drummond. Here you see it. I found it both in his archives and then in the League of Nations archives. They kept a copy in which he really says, look, we as the jury found a dead end. We don't have the legal tools to select a winner. And I think that you as the Secretary General should intervene. And then Drummond, replying very legally, says that this is simply a matter that is not between his jurisdictional competence. They had empowered a jury of architects to take these decisions. It couldn't be Drummond who decided unilaterally. And at the end, basically, what Horta did is that, seeing that they were unable to find a victor, then this competition, like the Great War that had preceded it, would be a war with no victors. At the end, they selected a series of projects that they gave some sort of commendation. They distinguished between different qualities of projects and gave 9, let's say, prizes on equal footings, 18 memorable honorable mentions, but at the end, no prize or no design would be selected for the League of Nations building. And here you see just some of the winners, both the kind of first 9 prizes. Again, you see a couple of German architects, which is interesting because of the reason I was mentioning before. But prominently at the end, what this really meant in practice is that it was basically a stalemate between those who really wanted the modernist proposal 273, authored by Le Corbusier and his cousin Pierre Jeanneret. You see it, for instance, over here. This is the kind of original design and composition of how the building should like, versus those who wanted a more traditional, especially neoclassical sort of architecture in the academic fashion, of which, for instance, this project by Broggi and some of his colleagues is a good example. So in a way, you see two very different ideas of what the League of Nations is, what it represents, what it shows in the world. I mean, I don't want to lean too much into this. There are people who say if they had selected the Le Corbusier project, the League would have survived. Well, no, that's not necessarily the argument I'm trying to make, but just seeing the difference between the two buildings, you see that there's something at stake beyond simply a question of taste. There are political values about, for instance, what is man's relationship to industry or the industrial modes of production that are really at stake. There are kind of very different ideas of what it means to be a dignified kind of polity or a dignified sort of building for international diplomacy. So those are the kind of debates I was interested in. Again, from a legal history perspective, what is interesting is that at the end, basically, the both sides of the jury use legal arguments to discredit their opponents. Basically, the academic faction says the problem with Le Corbusier and his cousin's project is that it didn't follow the rules related to the ink of the proposal. So that's it, they're disqualified, game over. On the other hand, the modernists say, well, the problem with the other kind of neoclassical projects, the academic projects, is that they're very expensive. They just cost way much more than the kind of actual budget, the kind of limited budget of the league for the project. And you see a little bit in the difference between the buildings why that can be the case, of course. And eventually, what the league decided within its annual committee is that it created then a new organ. So again, typical league procedure. No, we cannot solve a problem. Let's compose another committee who will solve it, in which now diplomats from five member states of the league, Japan, Czechoslovakia, Greece, surprisingly Colombia, and the British Empire, basically came to a diplomatic solution to this impasse. And at the end, basically, they raised the budget, which clearly was in a way to say that they also wanted a more academic and even at the end of the day, neoclassical project. At the end, different things change because of the intervention of the Rockefeller family, which, as I mentioned, was quite important both for this building and for the UN complex in Manhattan. The League decided to leave its former lakeside property, which is here in red, and instead move up to a park, the Ariana Park in the Geneva, which of course still overlooks the lake, but it's a little bit different, and instead build the building there. And at the end, after a long process of negotiation, what the League decided is that at the end, the Project 387, which had been submitted by the Frenchman Minot, a Swiss architect called Julien Flegenheimer, would be the one selected, but that to help him, they would invite other first prize winners to collaborate, including Broghi from Italy, Lefebvre from France, and Bago from Hungary, but at the time had really kind of, franchised in very important ways. And basically what this meant was a total victory for the academic faction. There's no other way to look at it. It was seen as such by everyone involved. Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret were very angry about it, and just that's what I mentioned just before concluding. It was interesting to me how then these modern architects then turned to the law to challenge the League of Nations. And of course, they did first and foremost what they knew very well to do. That is, public opinion, public interventions. For instance, here you see in yellow a very famous this is very famous in the art world, a kind of manifesto that Le Corbusier and his allies circulated, very damning day by day. You see, it's really a timeline, the kind of all legal mistakes that the League of Nations had done in its operations, raising all sorts of inconsistencies, problems, etc. But I think above all, as a legal historian, I was interested in the document you see on the left. It is a sort of legal suit that they're trying to bring before the members of the Council and the Council of the League of Nations. And to do that, they hired the help, the assistance of André Prudhomme, a very famous French international lawyer at the time. Eventually, this is dismissed. Basically, what happens is that the League of Nations say that as individuals, Le Corbusier did not have standing to petition the League of Nations. If he wanted to do so, he had to do so through France or through Switzerland. That eventually happened also with no success to France in particular. But I think it was a good example of the ways in which, if we tend to think of the League of Nations in the early 20th century as the entrance of the individual into international relations, what we see that for these purposes, architects were still not individuals with capacity to petition for these purposes. And eventually what Le Corbusier does is to publish a very damning book, you see it here on the right, in Maison un Palais, criticizing the whole thing. And it's full of, let's say, different areas of concern with the League. But above all, what he suggests is that the fundamental flaw of the League was that it remained embedded to the idea that it needed a palace. And because of its commitment to a palace and to this kind of more aristocratic form of governance, it had missed the opportunity to make what he really offered, which was some sort of modern workhouse for international diplomacy. And all of this is important because a couple of years later in New York, he would try again. But I won't bore you too much with the details of that story. I'll just conclude that the whole experience, I think, was quite formative, not only for international lawyers, but also for architects, especially those associated with the modern movement itself. In fact, in the same years that the League would start building its neoclassical building in the Switzerland, at the shores of the Lake Léman, but a little bit further down, closer to Montreux, in what was the Castle of La Sarraz, there would be the congregation of what is now called the International Congress of Modern Architecture. And there you see a lot of the leading protagonists of the League of Nations story and debacle. So Le Corbusier would be there, Karl Moser would be there, Siegfried Gideon, who I mentioned, would be there. More can be said about Hélène de Mandrot, the particular woman who owned the castle where they met. She also had some connections to the Ariana Park, but I won't go into the details of that. But I think what is interesting is that what the kind of whole League of Nations experience told these architects is that if they wanted the modern movement to triumph, the modern movement in architecture, I mean, what they needed was not to be dependent on the League's internationalism, but to create an internationalism of their own. And this was eventually their proposal in this big Congress that, kept them moving and later became a towering figure of the 20th century. And in a way, I think that allows me to conclude some of the things I was interested throughout the chapter. Of course, Horta was not a protagonist here. He was not invited. But I think what's interesting is that it shows how the promise of creating some sort of liberal internationalism embodied in the League of Nations not only spurred the creation of many other internationalist projects, such as this of the Congress, but most importantly, it put the League in a position where it had to justify its own political and legal decisions against its own promise of a more democratic, rule-based order. And on that count, just like the League of Nations, just like the United Nations nowadays, the League was often found wanting. I think I'll stop here, but again, I look forward to any comments and questions, and I thank you all again for the support back in 2022 and today, of course.